Hi, and welcome to this week's storyboard, where we are going to carry on with the story of Moses. Last time we saw how Moses had gone before Pharaoh. Here's Pharaoh standing up this time, and here's one of his assistants. Here's one of the men who were oppressing God's people, the Israelites. We know that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. You can see the storyboard looks slightly different this week. We're still in Egypt. Here's one of the houses of the people. This is one of the houses that the Israelites lived in. And we saw last week how Moses goes before the king with his brother. Here's his brother, Aaron. And Moses says to the king, "Let my people go." In fact, it's Aaron that speaks. God speaks to Moses, and Moses speaks to Aaron, and Aaron speaks to Pharaoh, the king. And because Pharaoh would not let God's people go out of slavery, God sent some terrible plagues upon Egypt. And we saw last time what one of those plagues was, and it was the plague of blood, where the whole river Nile and all the water supply of Egypt turned to blood. But still the king was stubborn and would not let God's people go. So Moses goes again to the king with his brother, and they say to the king, "Let my people go." Can you say that with me? Okay, I'd like you to do that. I'd like you to put your hands over your mouth and say, "Let my people go." Are you ready? Go. "Let my people go." And Pharaoh would say, "No." And so the next plague would come upon Egypt. And the next plague, do you know what the next plague was? It was a plague of, you know what this is? Yep, frogs. Here we are, the plague of frogs. Frogs were everywhere. They came up out of the Nile, the river. They went into people's homes. They got into their beds. They got amongst their food. It was horrible, but still Pharaoh was stubborn and would not let God's people go. So the next day, Moses and Aaron go before the king, and what do they say? That's right, "Let my people go." The next plague would be a plague of gnats. Gnats like dust. Moses would take his staff, he would hit the ground like that, and the dust would come up and it would turn to gnats. Gnats everywhere like dust all over Egypt. Still the king was stubborn and would not let the Israelites go from their slavery. So the next plague was a plague of flies, and here's a fly. Bzzz. Okay, let's put the plague of flies up here. Look at it. A plague of flies covered Egypt. But still the king would not let the Israelites go. So the next plague would affect the animals. Okay, so let's put some animals here, shall we? So there were goats, and there were some cows and bulls. There were some sheep. The Bible tells us that all the animals that the Egyptians had, the sheep, the goats, the donkeys, the camels, all died. Yeah, sorry about that, but they did. They all died. But the animals that lived in the part of Egypt where God's people, the Israelites, lived, didn't die. They were kept protected. In fact, God's people were protected from all the plagues by God. He made a distinction and protected his people, but the Egyptians who worshipped other gods and idols were affected by all the plagues. Well, the next plague would affect people, and it would be horrible festering boils that would come out on people's faces and all over their bodies, from Pharaoh himself right through the people of Egypt. They were all affected, but still Pharaoh was stubborn and would not let God's people go. So the next day, Moses and Aaron go before the king, and what do they say? "Let my people go!" But the king still says no. So the next plague is a plague of hailstones. Terrible storm, lightning, hailstones like golf balls that fell from the sky and ruined all the vegetation, broke down the plants, affected the trees, but still the king would not let the Israelites go. The next plague would be the 8th one, and it would be locusts! Locusts everywhere! And the locusts came in like a swarm and ate its way through all the greenery, the crops, the plants, ate all the crops that had been broken down by the hailstones. And so Egypt was devastated because of the locusts. When the locusts had gone, Moses and Aaron go before the king again, and they say to the king, "Let my people go." But still the king is stubborn. And the next plague would be a plague of darkness. 3 whole days and nights of thick darkness, so thick that you could not see the person next to you. It was dangerous to come out of your own house. Now it's interesting that each of these plagues was against a different god that the Egyptians worshipped. Some of you might know, some of you at school might know this, that one of the gods the Egyptians worshipped was the sun. And the sun was called Ra, or that's what they called it, Ra. And so the God of heaven, the one true God who made the sun, switched it off. So its light didn't shine, to show all the people that he was the true God and that the sun was made by him and wasn't a god at all. So that was 9 plagues. Well, the next plague would be terrible and would affect the firstborn child in every family in Egypt. There would be death in each family. But God said to his people, the Israelites, this is what you're to do. You are to take a lamb or a goat that is 1 year old. You are to check that lamb and goat. You are to inspect it and make sure that there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it needs to be as perfect as it can be. And then you're to kill it. And you're to paint its blood over the door of your house. So you see the house over here, and they were to paint the blood across the top of the house, down the side of the door, and down the side of the other door. And let's put this man over here. And this is the man. He's an Israelite man. He lives in this house with his wife and his children. This is his daughter. We'll put them there. And they obeyed God. In fact, we understand that all the Israelites did as God had said. They painted the blood down the sides and across the top of the door. And that night, the angel of death came upon Egypt. And in every home that did not have the blood on the wood over the door and down the sides, someone died in that family. But those who had the blood, the angel of death passed over. It passed over, and everyone in that house was kept safe. Do you know, it reminds us, doesn't it, of what would happen many years later when Jesus came and his blood was spilled, wasn't it, on the cross. That was made of wood as well. And Jesus took, his life was taken in order that ours might be delivered. And Jesus was the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So that happened, and it was terrible. Even Pharaoh himself's own son died at that time. Well, after that happens, Pharaoh changed his mind. He called for Moses and Aaron, and he said to them, "Take the people and leave Egypt." And that's what Moses and Aaron began to do. And so we're going to leave Egypt now, and we're going to take the pyramids away, and we're going to take this house away. And we're going to take these people away, and we can see that the following morning, all the Israelites gathered together. Do you know, there were like 2 to 3 million of them. Wow. They all gathered up. Now you have to pretend that there is this many now. There's not, of course, but there were so many. And they all lined up in their tribes, and there were the leaders and the families. They were all there. So many of them. In fact, they took gold and they took silver from the Egyptians. They took materials from them because they were going to travel now back to the land that is today called Israel. But they're going to have to travel through the desert, the wilderness. And do you know, it's going to take them quite a long time to travel through there. And so, led by Moses and Aaron, they march out. They've got their flags as well that they're carrying. And they probably were singing as all of them marched out of slavery. They're excited because they're going to meet with God. They're going to meet with the God of heaven. And do you know where they're going to meet him? They're going to meet him at the mountain. Probably the same mountain range where Moses met God at the burning bush. And God would lead them, and he would lead them in a cloud. Let's put the cloud here. God himself would be in a cloud, and he would lead them by day in a cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire. He would go before them, and he would protect them. But as they came out of Egypt, marching, singing probably, they came to the sea. Do you know what the sea was? It was called the Red Sea. And there was no bridge. In fact, the people turned to Moses and they said, Moses, how are we going to get across the sea? And then they looked behind them, and the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had got his chariot and his army, and he changed his mind. In fact, he was bringing the army to come and to kill the Israelites, or to bring them back into slavery again. The people panicked. They didn't know what to do. They started to say to Moses, what should we do? They were stressed. They were worried. Moses prayed to God, and God spoke to him and said to him, Moses, stand still and you will see what I will do. God told Moses to take his staff, his stick, to reach it out across the sea. And as he did it, God sent a massive wind, and it blew the sea apart. And so there was a big wall of water on the left and a big wall of water on the right. And he made a way through the sea on dry ground. Do you want to see a picture of what that might have looked like? Can you see that picture? A wall of water on the left and one on the right. And Moses and Aaron led the people through the Red Sea. They saw an incredible miracle of what God had done. God protected them from the Egyptians with the pillar of fire, and they couldn't attack the Israelites. But once they'd gone through, the Egyptians followed them through the sea. And do you know what happened? And we're going to finish with this bit. The wall of water on the left collapsed on the Egyptians. The wall of water on the right collapsed on the Egyptians. And the Egyptian army all died in the Red Sea. God's people, the Israelites, came through the Red Sea, and they stood on the shores the other side. They were about now to go into the wilderness, the desert, where they were going to meet God. Next week, I'm going to tell you what happened when they came to Mount Sinai, and how God led them, how God looked after them, and how God provided for them in a desert. See you next time.